In 1927, the United States is in the third year of recovery after a steep recession in the early 20s. And in May, the Dow Jones Index on the New York Stock Exchange recovers to the inflation-adjusted value from just before when the U.S. entered World War I. The U.S. economy is now heading towards the height of the Roaring Twenties. Welcome to Between Two Wars, a chronological summary of the interwar years, covering all facets of life, the uncertainty, hedonism, and euphoria, and ultimately, humanity's descent into the darkness of the Second World War. I'm Indy Neidell. In our 1921 episode that covered U.S. isolationism, we saw how President Warren G. Harding was loosening the reins on the American markets. Now in 1927, since Harding's sudden death in office in 1923, his Vice President Calvin Coolidge has been at the helm of the United States. Together with Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, President Coolidge has continued a policy largely oriented at letting the financial bulls run free and uninhibited. Yes, the main focus of the U.S. shall be commerce, or, as the president himself famously declares, the chief business of the American people is business. Money is cheap to borrow. Any regulations that might inhibit a free market are being removed, and the economy is left largely to take care of itself. In 1927, it looks very much like this is paying off, with rapid economic growth and increasing riches for at least some of the American people. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that the U.S. economy is roaring. But only a few years ago, it had been squeaking, groaning, and faltering when depression hit as the world struggled to recover from the Great War. Sure, America's economy was doing pretty well in the war years. It supplied war-torn Europe even before it entered the conflict, and this led to a manufacturing boom. Employers were enjoying wartime wage controls, and there was full employment across the labor force. Rural America also did extremely well. With the country acting as the Allies' breadbasket, farmers enjoyed rising prices and increasing demand. This all changes when the war ends. The economies of Europe are in chaos, and the demand for exports drops sharply. But America's manufacturing industry is still producing a mass of goods that they suddenly don't have anyone abroad to sell to. So domestic prices shoot up to make for the loss of profits. Meanwhile, veterans are returning from the war, causing a surplus in the labor market. All this means that by 1920, the American economy is in recession. The Ford Motor Company has to close its Michigan plants, and unemployment rises across the country, peaking at 11.7% in 1921. Farmers who had confidently bought new land and new machines on loan are now drowning in debt as falling profits force them to default on their credit. Simply put, things are not looking good. However, unlike much of Europe, America still has its economic infrastructure intact and an abundant amount of natural resources. This advantage contributes to a consumer revolution never seen before. So, one of the big contributors to the recession was overproduction. Now, before the war, Henry Ford, founder of the Ford Motor Company, had pioneered new mass production techniques that dramatically increased the efficiency and potential of American industries. Assembly lines were introduced, meaning workers only worked on one part of a product before moving it down to a colleague. Before the introduction of this technique, the assembly of a car chassis in a Ford factory took around 12 and a half hours. By 1914, this was down to 93 minutes. Well, this was all well and good when American industry had foreign markets to sell to, but the chaos of the post-war economy means that the U.S. is now churning out goods so fast, domestic demand just can't keep up. American business owners now need a way to increase consumer demand. Enter Edward Bernays. During the war, Bernays had sat on the Creel Commission, who were responsible for convincing the American public about the necessity of entering the Great War. The commission used the increasing access to print and out-of-home mass media to spread their message through a campaign of newspaper articles, ads, billboards, and public speeches. It was a huge success, and Bernays realized the commission had hit on a winning formula. Bernays is related to the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, whose discovery of the unconscious mind becomes hugely influential in the new science of public relations that Bernays is pioneering. He believes that companies could make consumers want to buy new products by appealing to their unconscious mind. He says, if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? Bernays publishes his thoughts in several books, and his ideas soon spread. Advertising now goes from simply listing products in newspapers to companies selling dreams of social status, happiness, power, sex. General Motors, one of Ford's biggest competitors, leads the way. Whereas Ford's Model T is sold on its durability and affordability, General Motors start to sell their cars on the basis of how new and attractive they are. New designs are presented as the best yet, and even when fresh technologies do not emerge, General Motors redesign cosmetic aspects of their cars to give them renewed appeal. This is accompanied by massive marketing campaigns in magazines and newspapers. Adapted to the type of reader and car, ads now feature either smiling families or attractive women laying across the fenders. These new marketing techniques lead to an explosion in consumerism. For example, the number of American households owning a radio rises from 60,000 to over 10 million. Businesses are also diversifying and expanding into new markets. In the late 1920s, Colt Firearms begins to manufacture dishwashers, and Remington Arms starts to make cutlery and vending machines. The decade sees America transformed into a consumer society. 2/3 of everything it produces is soon consumed by individuals in the domestic market. People are in a spending mood, and this helps the economy to literally boom. A big factor in encouraging the spending spree is the introduction of consumer credit. General Motors once again leads the way. If you wanted to buy a car before or during the war, you needed to provide immediate cash payment. Some banks and companies had begun to experiment with purchase plans, but it is in 1919 when the General Motors Acceptance Corporation is established to finance automobile purchase that this trend takes off. The influential magazine, the Literary Digest, estimates that of the 4 million cars sold in 1923, only 1 million are actually bought with cash, the rest being sold on installment plans. Borrowing is no longer a sign of being poor, and it's now used to buy everything from furniture to radios to irons and every luxury or domestic item the consumer can get their hands on. The engine behind this consumer culture is the stock market. This is a monumental change. Until now, the stock market has reflected the market, but now it starts driving the value of the market. Some might call this the tail wagging the dog, but no one seems to see this as a problem. Historian Charles R. Geist says that the excess spending of the decade was based on the perception that economic life was getting better all the time. Most people looked to the stock market as proof of that, and few were willing to dissuade them. So, the stock market now becomes a symbol of what will soon be called the American dream. John Raskob, a high-flying financial executive and businessman, famously captures the mood when he declares in an interview, if a man saves $15 a week and invests in good common stocks and allows the dividends and rights to accumulate, he will be rich. And because income can do that, I am firm in my belief that anyone not only can be rich, but ought to be rich. Raskob is no doubt a bit deluded over how easy it was to become rich. In any case, ordinary people are actually investing and speculating more than ever before in the pursuit of wealth. A significant factor which led to this was the selling of government bonds during the war. All sides in the World War took part in bond campaigns where citizens would purchase a bond from a government and then get their money back and more when the bond matured. Basically, people would invest in their government. And it was a great way to raise public finances without increasing taxes, which is unpopular, or printing more money, which causes inflation. America sold the bonds as Liberty bonds, and they were hugely successful. Investors, large and small, bought up bonds, and millions of ordinary Americans who had never invested before got involved. Brokerage firms also benefited from this, as the vast increase in bonds they sell gives them stronger footholds on the market. Thus, Liberty bonds and their guaranteed profits have now given Americans a taste of investment, and a new fever and trading boom soon takes hold. It's tricky to know the exact numbers for sure, but one contemporary writer estimates that before the war, only around 500,000 Americans had been involved in the stock market, whereas by early 1929, it is as many as 15 million. Bonds are still the most popular form of investment, but ordinary Americans are also increasingly getting involved in speculating on the stock market. Whereas bonds are essentially loans with a guarantee to get it back with profit, stocks buy you part ownership of a company, and the amount of money you make or lose is dependent on how well the company is doing. This is much riskier, but it can also give you much higher returns. The scale of this investment fever is put into material terms by the financial editor of the New York Evening Post in 1928, who estimates that in a typical day, around 4,000 miles, that's 6,400 kilometers, of tape is consumed to tick off trades on the New York Stock Exchange, along with 1.5 million phone calls being made in just one 5-hour session. On top of all this, people are starting to use the stock market as a sort of bank, pumping their savings into it, thinking that like with bonds, there is a guaranteed profit to be made. America is investing, and it looks good, with the number of millionaires steadily climbing. In 1925, 75 people report an annual income of $1 million. By 1927, this has risen to 283. There are probably even more than this in reality. Profits from investments are easier to hide than salaries. And many find that speculating on the market is an easy way to avoid income tax. Women are also able to take part in this new craze. While the U.S. in the 1920s is hardly a feminist paradise, women are now enjoying greater freedoms in American society. Wives are given more discretion in the handling of family finances, and women's magazines have begun to offer investment information and advice. Radio also plays a role, broadcasting investment ads and financial news at times when housewives will likely be at home. It is estimated that women account for 35% of the total stock market volume. Women make up more than half of the shareholders of AT&T and about 37% of U.S. Steel. And by the numbers, it does seem that women are experiencing unprecedented wealth. But what will Americans do with all this money flying around? Predictably, it goes hand in hand with a massive change in American culture. One place they spend their new money is entertainment. The already rapid growth in popularity of cinema reaches new heights. In 1928, 65 million tickets are being sold each week. A staggering figure when you consider the total population of the U.S. is around 120 million. And it's also becoming a more middle and upper class leisure activity, and films increasingly display stories of opulence and elegance to reflect the ideal of consumption that has taken hold. The economic boom fuels nightclub culture, and the massive increase in the popularity of the radio and phonograph means that jazz music was spread to new audiences. The heady consumerism of the era seems to match this modern and exuberant sound, and already before the decade is over, the 1920s becomes known as the Jazz Age. Dances such as the Charleston become popular among America's youth, and women, with more money to spend than ever, embrace the flapper lifestyle. The statement by renowned classical conductor Leopold Stokowski that jazz has come to stay because it is an expression of the times, of the breathless, energetic, superactive times in which we are living. It is useless to fight against it, captures the relationship jazz has to this new American age. But while the Roaring Twenties creates unprecedented affluence among parts of the population, this new wealth is not spread evenly. Most people across America are still struggling, experiencing no boom, instead facing growing social issues. Rural America never really recovers from its post-war slump. Bankruptcies from Midwestern farms quadruple in 1922 and double again in 1923. The South, in particular, sees little economic prosperity. Ravaged by the Civil War half a century ago, and never really adapted to the changes required by the end of slavery. Many parts of the South languish in poverty throughout the 20s. This is especially true for farmers who have to rent their land from landowners. A disproportionate amount of the renting farmers were African American. The struggles of rural America also lead to national tensions as powerful voices representing agrarian interests present Wall Street as the root of their troubles, destroying the traditional way of life. But it isn't just farmers who don't see a boom. All over the United States, money is spread unevenly, with 90% of the country's wealth held by 5% of the population, and just 200 corporations controlling half of the corporate wealth. A lucky few on the East Coast are accumulating massive fortunes, but the national average wage is less than $1,500 per year. Despite the new popularity of jazz music, African Americans remain on the economic margins and are forced to live in ghettos, away from the wealth of Wall Street. Black music might be the era's zeitgeist, but black audiences are barred from some of the most famous jazz clubs, and black musicians are often undercut and mistreated by white musicians and managers. So, like in many parts of the world, American society is struggling with inequality on various levels that creates tensions and poses a risk that endangers stability and growth. But the most dire threat is coming from the hidden dangers in the credit-based consumer and investment culture that is still creating growth in the United States. Growth that also spills over to the European countries. The rapid rise in stock prices is creating a bubble that will one day have to burst. Savings are almost depleted. Even the banks have lower reserves of capital, now turning to their colleagues in Europe to satisfy their need for new cash to lend and invest. What's more, credit will be catching up with people by the end of the decade, and consumers will soon realize the implications of spending beyond their means. The laissez-faire policies of the U.S. administration may have allowed for unprecedented wealth for some, but it is also leading to unstable, unequal, and unsustainable growth. Despite isolationist economic tendencies in many parts of the world, the economies are becoming increasingly interlocked as investments and profits ebb and flow across the planet. The U.S. economy has become a hub in an international money wheel spinning faster and faster and faster. And if that hub should crack, the wheel driving the world economy will come apart. That would create a global financial crisis. If you'd like to learn more about Henry Ford, including some of his less attractive characteristics, you can find our coverage of him in our World Dictionary series right here. Our TimeGhost Army member for this episode is Jory McCord. Be like Jory and sign up for the TimeGhost forces on Patreon or at timeghost.tv. It is what keeps our wheels rolling. Subscribe, ring the bell, live long, and prosper.